Okay, I'm going to get us started. So hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Smith, and I'm excited to welcome you to the second event in the online portion of the Sovereign Intimacies exhibition. I am one of the co-curators of Sovereign Intimacies, an exhibition that's put on in partnership between Gallery 1CO3, Plug In ICA, and with support of Video Pool Media Arts Center. So I am the guest curator for Gallery 1CO3 and have had the absolute honor and privilege of co-curating this exhibit with Nasrin Himada, the curator at Plug In ICA. I would like to acknowledge that we are here today on Treaty 1 territory, the territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and homeland of the Métis Nation. For me, this land acknowledgement is about acknowledging my Métis ancestors who have always inhabited the lands in and around Winnipeg. I am lucky to walk in their footsteps and to live on the land and to love this place that we have lived for centuries. This evening, we are coming together for the Unspoken film and video program that you can watch on vukavu.com as free public programming until November 18th. This has been curated by Mariana Muñoz Gomez and Marianne Redhead. And in the planning stages of Sovereign Intimacies, Nasrin and I knew that this exhibition was about collective voices of our community, and that as many perspectives and themes needed to come together to be added to the discussion that we were already having. It is thrilling to have the curatorial vision of Mariana and Marianne as part of the exhibition, and that they have invited Marissa Sean Cruz and Léuli Eshrāghi to be in the discussion with them this evening. I'm going to pass it over to Nasrin to tell you a little bit more about Sovereign Intimacies.
Thank you, Jen. Sovereign Intimacies is a group exhibition that, as Jen said, is in partnership with Gallery 1CO3 with support from Video Pool Media Arts Center. The exhibition takes place at Plug In and is on view until December 20th, although for the moment we have had to close our doors as per the new health restrictions, but we are so excited to have planned such an extensive online program that consists of talks, workshops, the screening and discussion, and poetry readings. Sovereign Intimacies explores themes of cultural community and exchange between Indigenous artists and artists from the diaspora. And I know and understand this term is quite challenging, and many people have asked us about what exactly we mean by this term diaspora. And I think the term is getting more and more complicated for us as we have these ongoing discussions with our communities and interlocutors. One thing that has come up out of many conversations and that sticks out for me is that this term can also apply to the Indigenous experience on this land and not just for those who come from elsewhere. As we know, colonization has manifested in a way where borders were drawn where there were none. For us, the term diaspora has come to present something quite specific, but also expansive. So I'd like to just read a little from the essay that Jen and I wrote for the exhibition to touch on what it is we are grappling with when it comes to these relations. The essay is written as a conversation between Jen and I, and here I'm responding to Jen. This exhibition is for us. When I refer to us, I mean you and me and all the artists we have worked with on this, and for our friends and our families, and the communities who desire conversations between us. We who come from a lineage of people impacted by colonial and white supremacist violence. In order to emphasize the ways in which through our struggles, love, and care, we build our solidarity. So for me, the curatorial ethics we have built together with the artists and through encounters with their artworks are grounded in relations and in the question of how do we continue to show up for each other. It is through this intention that I believe liberation manifests in these intimacies that are sovereign. So for us, the artists presented in this exhibition offer forms of collectivity that are based on the principles of taking time, learning, listening, letting the process guide the work. Each in their own way, the artists have provided a space in which to consider intimacy as active, as action, and as change. The exhibition in all its forms features the work of Hassan Ashraf, Annie Beach, Ayomi Goto, Iris Yurihu, Melanie Monoceros, Peter Morin, Mariana Muñoz Gomez, Wanda Nanabush, Emnor Besse Phillip, Megan O'Brien, Marianne Redhead, Cheyenne Thomas, and David Thomas. And I'm so excited that this discussion is part of this exhibition and hope you all had a chance to watch the screening Unspoken. And if not, it is still available, as Jen mentioned, at Vukovu until November 18th. I'm now going to pass it back on to Jen to introduce the curators of this program and the moderators of tonight's conversation.
So before I do that, I would also just like to send thank yous out to Jennifer Gibson from Gallery 103, who helped organize our event tonight and was an integral part of organizing the exhibition as a whole. And thank you to Evan from the University of Winnipeg, who is helping with the live stream, AI Media for providing us with live closed captioning, Video Pole Media Arts Center, who have partnered with us to host the screening, and the staff at vukavu.com who are hosting the online screening of Unspoken. And thank you to all of the team at Plug In ICA for all of the work that they have contributed to these programs. So finally, I get to introduce you to Mariana Muñoz Gomez and Marianne Redhead. Mariana Muñoz Gomez is an emerging artist, writer, and curator. She is a settler of color based on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Her work is concerned with language, representation, diaspora, displacement, and identity within post and settler colonial contexts. She is a co-editor of Carnation Zine and co-curator of Window Winnipeg. Mariana recently completed a Master's of Art in Cultural Studies, curatorial practices at the University of Winnipeg. Marianne Redhead is an Innu and Francophone, as well as an emerging curator, writer, and member of the Fox Lake Cree Nation. She is currently completing her Bachelor of Arts with an honors degree at the University of Winnipeg, and with the intent to pursue an MA in the curatorial stream of the Cultural Studies program. Through her research and creative practice, she is interested in deep colonial art forms, contemporary Indigenous art, futurisms, language, and relationship-based identities. We're so grateful that both of you have been part of this wonderful, or have created this wonderful program, and I'm going to hand it over to you to host the rest of our evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Nasrin. Tense Natotimak, Marianne Netisinigasun. So I am a co-curator for the Unspoken program, along with Mariana Muñoz Gomez. Thank you to everyone for showing up. It's really nice to see some familiar faces. Thank you again to Video Pool Media Arts Center, Gallery 103, Plug In ICA, the staff at Vukovu, and just, yeah, special thank you to Jennifer Gibson, Emma Hendricks, Jacqueline Hebert, and of course, again, once again, Jen Smith and Nasrin Himada for inviting us to participate in this exhibition, Sovereign Intimacies. And thank you so much to the artists and distributors who have worked with us to put together this program.
So as Jen and Nasrin said, the exhibition Sovereign Intimacies explores themes of cultural and community exchange. In the exhibition description, they write this exchanges between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis artists, and artists whose histories are not part of the settler colonial history of this country. So as curators of this screening, Marianne and myself wanted to acknowledge our own positions here on Treaty 1 territory. We are both guests on this land. I was born in Mexico, in Pachuca Hidalgo, and although my family is not necessarily from that state, we kind of have family throughout Mexico. So I've been fortunate to be able to visit my family quite often and kind of think of Winnipeg as my home base. And Marianne, I'll pass it off to you.
Yeah, so Winnipeg is the latest star in my constellation of homes, but it's not where my ancestors on either side of my family are from. Huichaqueo, which is Cree for going home star, or standing still star, or just known as the North Star, is always going to be made up of that cluster of areas where I first came into the world between Churchill and Fox Lake, which is Treaty 5 in northern Manitoba. This was the world of my grandparents on my father's side, and my grandmother's people are from York Factory, but I am also a descendant of white Francophone settlers on my mom's side. So I sort of see myself as having doubly lost sort of important connections to community, place, and language. When I came down here to the South, here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 with my mom, which, you know, happens to a lot of us, we end up coming to the South. That was sort of a moment of loss, but also, once again, I was removed from any kind of urban Indigenous community when we were moved to the rural outskirts of Winnipeg. But, you know, that's just, many of us are sort of finding ourselves strewn about in this diaspora, and we may do, which in a way is kind of easier now through these sort of virtual communities. Migration, movement, displacement, and relationship to land are part of the themes that come up in the film and video works in Unspoken. These experiences are part of our own realities and shape our consideration of living and working here.
Just to describe the program a little bit, I'll read our description that we have on the Vukavu website. So Unspoken weaves together work by Indigenous artists and racialized artists in diaspora from all over the world. Each short film or video work takes up the theme of relationships. Relationships to each other, to culture and language, to place, to the land, to non-human beings, and to ourselves. Sometimes these relationships are fraught with fragmentation, dislocation, and disappearances due to the processes of colonialism, imperialism, and ecological devastation. These films encourage us to explore the ways that we relate to each other, to our worlds, to our histories, and to our ways of being.
So I'm just going to quickly just introduce the other artists that were part of this program. So first up, we had Anti-Objects, or Space Without Path or Boundary by Sky Hopinka. Yeah, basically in this film, we wanted to include it first because it sort of encompassed many of the threads that we saw coming up in the other videos. And then just a quote from Kengo Kuma, which was sort of what informed Sky Hopinka's work. Quote, "The individual is not autonomous, solitary object, but a thing of uncertain extent with ambiguous boundaries. So too is matter, which loses much of its allure the moment it is reduced to an object, shorn of its viscosity, pressure, and density. Both subject and matter resist their reduction into objects. Everything is interconnected and intertwined," end quote. So we were drawn to how Hopinka addresses matter and anti-objects in this film, and how he identifies localities of matter as language and conversation through the recordings of Wilson Bob and Henry Zank conversing in Chinook Wawa or Chinook jargon. And so just on Sky Hopinka, who is from the Ho-Chunk Nation and Pechanga Band of Luisiano Indians, was born and raised in Ferndale, Washington, and spent a number of years in Palm Springs and Riverside, California, Portland, Oregon, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In Portland, he studied and taught Chinook Wawa, a language indigenous to the lower Columbia River Basin. His video, photo, and text work centers around personal positions of Indigenous homeland and landscape, designs of language as containers of culture expressed through personal documentary and nonfiction forms of media. He received his BA from Portland State University in Liberal Arts and his MFA in film, video, animation, and new genres from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and currently teaches at Bard College in film and electronic arts. We also included work by Karin Lee. So we had Small Pleasures, which is a film featuring 3 women, so First Nations, Chinese, and European, who use the pre-colonial trade language of Chinook jargon, which was just mentioned, to convey to each other complex ideas about feminist resistance in late 19th century Canada. So Karin Lee is a media artist whose films, installations, and writing spans over 2 decades, with fiction and nonfiction films reflecting the contemporary issues of our day, as well as the themes of Asian diaspora, women, gender, identity, and sexuality. Her solo show at the Sum Gallery in Vancouver's Art and Pride Society was the inaugural exhibition in Vancouver. As a filmmaker, Karin co-produced Cedar and Bamboo, a documentary about children of Chinese and First Nations parents, wrote, directed, and produced the web series Plan B, a dark comedic drama about an abortion clinic, and is currently in post-production for Girl with Big Feet, a period drama. A 4th-generation Canadian, Karin was born, raised, and is based in Vancouver, BC, Canada. And then we also have Hide by Sebastien Aubin, which is a collaborative production that was developed at the Banff Center's 2014 Aboriginal Visual Arts Residency. And it just features the hand-scraped hide of a barren ground caribou spinning to the tune of the sparkling winter sky. So with a Bachelor of Fine Arts major in graphic design from the University of Quebec, Sebastien Aubin has worked for Cologram, one of the most prestigious graphic design studios in Quebec, and has since shaped his professional career as a freelance graphic artist. Aubin has designed publications for numerous artists, organizations, and art galleries in Winnipeg, Montreal, and Ottawa, including Plug In ICA, Close Encounters, The Next 500 Years, Terrence Houle, Casey Adams, Carleton University Art Gallery, Thunder Bay Art Gallery, and Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba. Aubin is one of the founding members of the Itwe Collective that is dedicated to research, creation, production, and education of Aboriginal digital culture. Currently based in Montreal, Quebec, Sebastien Aubin is a proud member of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation in Manitoba.
Great, thank you, Marianne. And I'll introduce the last two filmmakers that are part of our program here. So Francisco Huichaqueo's film Ilwen, La Tierra Tiene Olor a Padre, or The Earth Smells of Father, is presented as a love story between a son and his father and the land. The film is in Mapuche and in Spanish, and includes part of an interview with the filmmaker's father reflecting on his relationship with his own father and with the land. Francisco Huichaqueo, Mapuche, studied documentary filmmaking at the Escuela de Cine de Chile. In addition to being a filmmaker, Francisco is a curator of video art, animation, and experimental films, and currently teaches animation and experimental video at the Universidad de Chile in Santiago. Next, I'm happy to introduce the two filmmakers that we have on this panel with us tonight. So thank you so much to Léuli and Marissa for being here. Léuli's poetic animation is a meditation on online access to the oldest bark cloths held in colonial collections. Tafa Oata exists as an animation with audio and as an animated text in Samoan and English. Let me just get to your bio here. Dr. Léuli Eshrāghi, Samoan, Persian, Cantonese, works across visual arts, curatorial practice, and university research. Ia intervenes in display territories to center Indigenous kin constellations, sensual and spoken languages, and ceremonial political practices. Through performance, moving image, writing, and installation, Ia engages with Indigenous futurities as haunted by ongoing militarist and missionary violences that once erased fa'afafine fatama from kinship and knowledge structures. Ia contributes to growing international critical practice across the Great Ocean in North America through residencies, exhibitions, publications, teaching, and rights advocacy. Eshrāghi is a board secretary of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, the inaugural Horizon Indigenous Futures postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University, a member of the Space Between Us Shirk Research Partnership, led by Dr. Julie Nagam, an affiliate member of the Wominjenka Jabana Research Lab at Monash University, led by Dr. Brian Martin, and a member of the Asia Pacific Research Network, led by Dr. Danny Butt at the University of Melbourne, and Kurniawan Adi Saputro at Indonesian Institute of the Arts, Yogyakarta. Also with us today is Marissa Sean Cruz, whose work Philippines is a digital environment of what they describe as a diasporic space. In Philippines, Cruz considers their relationship to place, family, and migration. Marissa Sean Cruz is an interdisciplinary artist based in Chibuktuk, Halifax, with a focus in video and digital arts. As a biracial Filipinx, Cruz's work negotiates a layered socio-racial identity in sculptural confrontations, conceptual systems, and prop comedy performances. Her work has been displayed in venues like X-Space, Studio 303, Studio Rialto, Gallery VAV Gallery, Third Space, and Start Gallery, and distributed digitally through spaces like the Center for Art and Thought, North Fork Arts Projects, Public Parking, and the Roundtable Residency. So thank you again so much, Léuli and Marissa, for joining us. I'm looking forward to this conversation and talking about your works. I thought that we could start off by just asking you to introduce your practices a little bit. So maybe Léuli, if you want to start.
On Talafalava, I will start by recognizing the jurisdiction of the Aranda Nation, on whose territory I'm tuning in from, in the center of Australia, a very violent racist place, but also beautiful sacred country. And yeah, my practice has been taking some interesting turns by being a guest in this territory. And particularly in April, I was due to return to my postdoc physically in Montreal. And instead, I've found myself living in kind of like the Yukon of Australia. So it's like sparsely populated, really sacred places and interesting communities. And work that I would do with people, I've been turning into kind of engaging with collections online. And it's something that I actually kind of wanted to do for a long time, thinking about the probably 95% of Samoan visual culture and that of all the most indigenous peoples of the Great Ocean lie in European and North American museum collections from that kind of period, but also collected. You know, the oldest is from the 1700s that I've come across until the 1960s. So it's been quite daunting when you can spend hours and hours and hours, weeks and weeks and weeks, looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of bark cloth that don't have names, don't have a lot of significance, and sometimes in forms like the hibiscus cloth, which is super rare, and I haven't heard of anybody making it for a few generations. So these kinds of, not to have like a narrative of absolute loss, but things go in cycles, and there are renewals and things change, of course. But particularly on being unable to return to the islands because they're blocked off from the world. And most of my family lives on the former German and British colonized side. And my mom is there, and there's also an American unincorporated territory to the east, similar to Puerto Rico and Guahan, where they don't have voting rights, but are, American enough for military enlistment, but not American enough for citizen rights and things like that. Anyway, to kind of bring that together, just thinking that I really wanted to find a way to continue my cultural journey as somebody who grew up in the diaspora in Australia and spent time as a child in Samoa, and kind of accessing a lot of these images online was some kind of way towards that. I think also my grandmother passed in July, and she was a really amazing artist, accomplished artist in a lot of customary art forms. So it's kind of a way of trying to deal with some of the loss and the grief by connecting with what perhaps she might have seen as a child or her ancestors made. Yeah, that's just a maybe brief overview. Yeah, I think I'm really interested in performance, and I have been working in performance collaboratively for a work that I titled Reconnaissance, which was presented in the Sydney Biennale Nasrin in March, where I worked with 3 friends from neighboring archipelagos to think about what healing and returning to a pre-colonial state of wellness as Indigenous gendered people, what that looks like for us. And we realized that we kind of have to grieve and go through a lot of pain first, because we're really brutalized communities today. And there's a lot of toxicity and lateral violence and literal violence as well. Kind of that's added on to all the epistemic violence of Western knowledge systems, and like the majority of Samoan literature, poetry, novels, etc., happens in English. So there's a lot of the thousands of years that we lived in the islands. It's kind of seen as this like the time of darkness, and then the arrival of the missionaries is like, oh, the coming of the light. And it's like, well, really, thousands of years of like harvesting and partying and getting lost at sea and then starting a new family on another island, like yeah, it's just a bit of a ramble overview.
Thank you, Léuli. Lots to talk about. I'll let Marissa introduce her practice a little bit, and then we'll get back to the conversation.
Thank you so much for everyone attending. I'm so thrilled to be amongst such an incredible group of people right now to talk about the things that I just make. It's like such an honor. Yeah, I guess I just also want to acknowledge that I am on Chibuktuk, which is unceded Mi'kmaq territory. I think that's just like a really important place for me to start, especially when we're talking about diasporic spaces. And this kind of interesting way that this like digital incubator can, in a way, interconnect us. But we also, of course, are influenced by other parts of technology that oppress us. So I think those are just part of my practice is really looking at the farces of those kind of binaries, and even going further, thinking about the way that there is this kind of complicated relationship with the settler and immigrant experience about how we can relate to this land, coming from a biracial perspective, both as a Filipinx person and my mother being a Scottish woman. I think about this kind of relationship and how there is a sense of pride in one degree of like, you know, my Filipinx family members have this like resurgence of pride and this narrative that's been built upon like a sense of liberation and freedom, but also this conflictual feeling that I have that this is not the land that we own. This is not the land that we were, you know, even the idea of property ownership, where this comes from. So I guess that's like a jumping place, especially as it relates to the project that is including in this program. But more broadly, I am a performance artist, a digital multimedia artist. I make my own sound. I love to dance. I make dance music, lip syncing, finding disruptive joy and humor, but really getting to talk about things that are quite serious. Love the cosplay, love fantasy. I think it maybe all like really goes towards speculative fiction, but I also think that I want to build futures that are also very much generative in the now. And I think like a lot of artists from the diaspora, Indigenous, Black artists are looking for things to happen now. And I want to be a part of that conversation. So brief overview about me, and I can't wait to, you know, dig into it a little more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you. I guess I'll just start with a question that just about something that kind of stood out to me about both of your works. You both use poetic language. Marissa, your text is organized in a way that invokes poetry in the digital sky that you've created. And Léuli, you use poetry as a way to narrate or reactivate or activate the bar cloth. Can both of you just talk a little bit about your use of poetic form in your work, and what does it mean to you to use poetry in your work? Maybe we could start with Léuli. Or
Thank you. I remember meeting a Greek Australian spoken word poet a few years ago who was winning a lot of the slam tournaments here, and said that you know that poetry started in Greece, and I was like, you're a very short time frame compared to many Indigenous cultures, and I'm pretty sure every human culture has a tradition of oratory and orature. So just to kind of atomize that statement that I remember hearing, I feel like what we call poetry is this like placeholder for the oratory, for the communication styles, which are speculative, as I'm learning more and more. These like genealogical epics that can go for days and days, but also there's like so much knowledge within that, and the kind of ethics around relationships to deities, to animals, to plants, to territories that you're supposed to look after. So whilst I can't write poetry entirely in Samoan language yet, it's my goal before I die, and there are very few translators that I'm able to work with because of how vociferous the Christian control of Samoan people's minds are. I'm not saying like I'm alone. Many artists, Samoan artists, work in this way, where we kind of have to play around a bit. All of the dictionaries were written by missionaries. They have omitted a lot of really important knowledge. So poetry for me is a way to switch between languages, and I think it definitely comes from more live performance. And I'm slowly working towards like putting a poetry book out sometime next year, hopefully. And I also like to kind of mix between Samoan language that I am ancestrally connected to, Bislama and Tokpisin, which are Creole languages from Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea, where I spent time and connected with communities from there, and then French and English, and sometimes Spanish, just to like decenter English as well. And it's funny because this kind of predates me spending time in Canada, in the territories that we call Canada. But yeah, I'm really resistant to this like way that everything can be accessible in English when a concept in many cultures on this planet can have like a 5-paragraph long explanation. So, and I think also the power of text. The most famous American anthropologist to visit my homelands, Margaret Mead, is responsible for a lot of misnomers and lies about us. So I feel like the power of text, the first person in my extended family to do a PhD, Julie Nagam, was one of my assessors. So, there's a lot of connections, and it's not always the path for everybody, but I really feel like writing and voice can be really generative and powerful. Thanks.
That was so generous. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm gonna learn a lot as we go through. I think poetics for me I would like to think that I embed them in everything. I think this is just like a very physical representation of it because it's like organized as such in stanzas. I don't think I would ever consider myself like a poet or writer because I honestly don't know if I would be able to like hold myself up against poets that I know and are really amazing to me. But I feel like my gravitation to use that kind of writing is looking at how language is a form of protection and preservation, but also what's lost in language. And for me, it's almost, especially when it's in the digitized form, and in my video, it is blended in this digital space. Relating it to a kind of code, I think is especially interesting when we think about identity and code and language as this space where we can morph and blend into these pixels, especially as someone who's racialized. It's like really ripe with critique on how we can look at contemporary culture as well. And I really do think it comes from like an emotive place too, which is maybe a bit indulgent, but yeah, I think writing that small piece of text really helped me be reflective as well. So including it within the actual digital space was also really important for me. And I think just integral to the work itself.
Yeah, thank you both. In my next question, I kind of talk about language. So we already talked about that a little bit, but I'm interested to see what you have to say, just talking more about language. So I was thinking about how the act of wandering comes up visually in a few of the works. So I was thinking with Sky Hopinka's anti-objects and also Marissa in your work Philippines. And Léuli, in your work Tafa'oata, you use voice and text to kind of take the listener and the reader of your work kind of through a landscape, one that is described through various deities' movements. So I was also thinking if you would like to share one of the links that you had ready, it might be nice to have the transcript of the poem on the screen. I'll just kind of finish my question here, but I was interested in the glossary that you provide for the English speakers. And I kind of learned through that glossary that you've written the poem through the lens of the moon, Messina, Lupe, royal pigeons, Pe'e, octopus, and Aveo, starfish, and Atauloa, centipede. So I'm interested for both of you what it means to be creative and to share your creative work in your various languages. So Léuli, I guess if I would like to start with you since you have that link to share.
If you could bring it up, please, Evan. I don't know how to, are we going to share screen or I could do it? Thank you. So, and if you slowly scroll down, please, that would be great. So you can see there are a lot of like place names, but also terms that I haven't got like footnote numbers next to. And I almost didn't have a glossary, and then I thought I should be nice and make it somewhat legible. So in this, because especially written in English, I degendered every deity that normally is assigned masculine or feminine since 1830 when English arrived. And part of that was one, you know, in Samoan language, there's no gender pronouns. There's only one, ia, that is neutral and it's used for anybody. And the social constructs of gender change depending on the role that you fulfill in a family or clan kind of village setting. So Masina is like grandmother moon, but I decided to kind of have it as more figure. And this work was made for World International Museum stay with the Art Museum at my last university, Monash University in Melbourne, in May. And you know, I remember, I'm sure everybody remembers, the first few months of COVID were very hard, still hard. But I really wanted to see how, like I kind of always don't want to write only in English. But if you don't, unless you have like multiple paragraphs with footnotes, it's kind of, it's like disjuncted kind of reading or writing. So I thought at least having those terms and my own kind of meaning, they're not necessarily the meanings you'll find in Google Translate or online dictionaries. Yeah, so I guess the primary thing for me was that I want my language to be spoken and I want my language to have a future. And most Samoans speak English. And if even in the old village, in my village and other villages, if people prefer to speak English, then when are we ever going to speak our language? And have critical work in it, poetic work in it. There is that work that happens, but it's quite like marginalized. Yeah, so thinking also about like the Wikipedia editathons and other things that have been happening in Montreal and elsewhere through like the art and feminism group and how to like increase presence online. So a very small contribution is just to have Samoan language there.
Thanks, Léuli. And Marissa, when I was thinking about language in your work, I was thinking partially about the writing that you have in Philippines, but I also came across another video from a little while ago, A Smoke-Filled Room, where you have captions in Tagalog. So yeah, so I'm interested in how you're working creatively with language as well.
Yeah, so I'm not a speaker of Tagalog. It's actually something that was lost, which I think it's relatable with lots of immigrant experiences, that it's kind of lost as a form of survival. My father grew up in Newfoundland, which is in St. John's, which is white dominated. And I think losing the language was both a decision that was made quietly amongst my Lola and Lolo, my grandmother and grandfather, because they wanted him to be better assimilated, basically. So returning to the language was something that I have kind of researched on my own. It's really interesting to learn from other folks amongst the diaspora. So I've been researching how to write in the pre-colonial script, and I've now been signing my name using this. And it's really beautiful, first of all, and really hard because I don't actually speak Tagalog. So what I've been doing is texting or like messaging my friends and getting them to translate it for me, and then I'll put it back. So it's this kind of like exchange that does make me feel more connected, but it's also something that makes me feel honestly vulnerable and a little bit sad that I can't be the one to do it. But also it does have this very strong like sense of collective and community that I can reach out to people who see me as valid and want to share this with me. So specifically in the smoke-filled room, which is a talk kind of about the way that history repeats itself, especially in the Philippines. Currently, the presidency is very much similar to the kind of fascist regime that was there during the Marcos era, which is when my family had left the Philippines. My great-grandfather being a very like outwardly anti-Marcos lawyer, having to kind of, I guess, it's just embedded within my own history of anti-fascist activism. And it really affected the way that I exist here now. So for that video, I use Tagalog in a way that it is at the bottom of the screen in like a closed caption. And I'm talking about the Jollibee, which is an Americanized fried chicken food chain that is from the Philippines. And the Jollibee is talking about their resume, and they're like talking about how they're really good in Photoshop and have experience with like cash transactions. So it's both funny, but also talking about like migrant labor and how it's often, a point of conversation when talking about Filipino people, that they're really hardworking, dedicated, also I think insidiously talking in a way about the model minority complex as well. So in that sense, I'm taking Tagalog, which is like a very like, it's like, it is emotional for me because I don't have that coming from within me, but I have like a collective experience and I can outreach to my friends who know it. But yeah, language and its loss are very, very much important in the way that I make work, and kind of talking about how I relate to identity, both culturally and racially, socially, kind of all these things.
If I can add, my Persian father lived in the Philippines and studied in Quezon City, along with a lot of Iranians during the Marcos years, and learned Tagalog at the same time as English, and then went to like fascist Queensland, northeast of Australia, during a fascist regime there. That was when I was born. So there's a lot of interesting kind of circular repetitions of history. And I think also perhaps my kind of coming to appreciating Samoan language is very recent, in the last like 3 years. I always was like, oh, maybe I should like invest my time in Maori or Hawaiian or an Aboriginal language here, like something that has a future. Because I just didn't believe that my language had a future. Also because my Persian family have been killed by the regime. And so we have a lot of language, like no one speaks Persian of my cousins who've been born in the diaspora. So it's quite a fast, successful kind kind of murderous regime. But yeah, just thinking also that like, I think I fill the gap of not speaking any Persian with everything else, and hope to like. I think I don't even allow myself to like dream of speaking Persian. I'm just like, oh, it's too hard. There's 60 million, 75 million. They're good, which is pretty ridiculous because it's like your own spiritual well-being.
Yeah, it's like this major, almost feels like an undertaking of sorts, or just like, I think it was almost just the time that it took for me to want to learn how to write in this like scripture, was also a lot of like me coming to know that I can, and that I want to. It was like a real like, as many people from the diaspora, wherever that may be, can kind of like relate to. It's like, you know, you may not feel like you can because of your intersection of identities and what those kind of look like for different for everyone, but like really just leaning into I guess the learning process of it. Yeah, and I think it was really like an honoring experience to learn new words and put in that time. Mm-hmm.
Is that the Babayan script, or is it one of the others? Amazing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, Marissa, we were interested in how in Philippines you create a digital environment that you describe as a diasporic space. We read your video as a psychological landscape to process the trauma and acts of survival that led to your family immigrating to so-called Canada. Can you tell us a little bit more about the space that you've created? And you've also shared that this video is related to a book that you were working on. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, for me, it was, again, kind of how I mentioned earlier, I also didn't want to make a space that felt, I guess, like stereotypical Canadian, and what the media will portray that to look like. It is just like kind of I don't think it's even, I think generic is even loaded. Like, I think this kind of like creation, I was thinking about what I know in my hometown, which is kind of these like rolling hills. That's kind of what I was looking to make, because I think any kind of landscape that you're building, digital or not, like from your computer, again, it's just like, there is weight to that. So I think it's referential kind of to my hometown as these like rolling, dry, grassy hills. And so this space, just to describe it a little bit, you're walking around and it's from the position like you're looking at the landscape. And I think that I was really looking at what it means to be walking also as well, even in a fictionalized space that is supposed to describe kind of the diasporic space itself. So what it means to be, I guess, suspended across oceans, per se. I mean, my family is all over the world, which is kind of wonderful that I can kind of go anywhere and have a place to be, but also really looking at what those spaces mean in terms of just physically. So making this digital space was a kind of a way to imagine that, but definitely don't want to have it be separate from, you know, the continued atrocities that colonialism has brought to each geographical location, because it's a global thing. And so when you walk through the space, you use your keypad, and you see like hundreds of photos of my father, who is the selfie taker of this century. It's kind of like you know, there's just like thousands of photos of my father in various locations. And to me, I read it in a poetic sense as I do, and thought of it as this kind of form of preservation, as this form of documentation. I mean, he always says that it's like when he gets old, he wants to look back on it and remember these things. And I just think about what it means to have those things physicalized and digitized. So I guess there is maybe something to be said about, I guess, like brown skinned people inserting themselves in places where they weren't supposed to be. And the book was almost, I think it was just like a timely thing that it happened to come out, I guess, like the similar time that the Kim Kardashian selfie book came out. And it reads like very similarly. So I was like, I don't know if I really want to like put these out together just yet. Kind of funny, but it is this like book, and all it is just the compilation of photos that are featured in the video. I think it's maybe a way that you can engage with like these photos in a different way. It's almost like when you are ordering something online and then it comes to you and there's this weird like digital and like physical object relationship that you have with the material that you saw on the screen versus like out of it. So I think it's just like another way to think about the object. And I don't know, I think it's something that the project will continue to build. Like I'll probably continue to add photos as they come. And I think the book is just something that at the time, I really wanted to put them all together and kind of another way to honor these images. Yeah.
Awesome, yeah. And I will ask the same question or a version of the question to Léuli as well. But just to read a bit, just for background, just to read a bit from our essay, I wrote, the modes of indigeneity represented here in our program embody what Gerald Visner calls native transmotion, which holds native stories of survivance. Quote, those creases of transmotion and native sovereignty are apprehended in the complementarities of stories, associations, intimacies, and reincarnations that resist absence and possession, end quote. Léuli and Sebastien Aubin's work demonstrate this as they both overlay the reanimation of material culture with sound. And then Léuli, you also write in your description of paper skin gesture, which is also sort of a response to the violence inflicted on material cultures by museum collections specifically. You write, quote, I can't write emails or essays about this dehumanization. I need to grieve and mourn in a shared ceremonial political structure that is sovereign of the extractive, consumptive gaze of Caucasian institutions, which denies in turn our agency and responsibility to our ancestral remains and belongings, to our continuing practices and presences. So you also use digital media to bring to life some of the material culture that has been put away into museum collections. Can you also talk a little bit about the potential of digital media in reanimating or reactivating material culture that has sort of been taken away from the cultures to which they belong? And then also you describe Tafa Owata as the dawn in a series of Siapo Viliata animated barcloths. So yeah, just tell us a little bit about that and maybe some of your recent work engaging with barcloth.
Thank you. Yeah, so paper skin gesture was a morning ritual. I don't really call it a performance, but it was at the launch of an art journal in Melbourne 2 years ago, edited by Maddie Clark and Nika Lehman, and it was the first time that a like really white art journal had Indigenous editors for the whole year, and that issue was called The Incredible Hotness of Decolonization. And it's all online on projects.org.au. You can have a read of those texts. And it marked about 2 years, a bit more than 2 years of a lot of the island communities in Melbourne. We've been sending emails to the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, in Tarndanyanga in Kaurna country, to cease having our ancestral remains on display. And they're not necessarily from Samoa, they're from other archipelagos, but it's a shared kind of weight. And I had like visited that space a few years before with a Kaurna and Maori artist, and was just like, what is this like? Because at the same time, you know, Aboriginal human remains have been off display since the 70s, but for Pacific, you know, it's somewhere over the rainbow. It's a non-place, even though Australia is in the Pacific, the Philippines are in the Pacific. There's such a Atlantis complex, I think, where people in Australia, New Zealand, imagine that they're somewhere between the US and the UK. So, and I think also that because we're not in that city in large numbers, they can't feel the pressure. So they weren't responding. They were like, yeah, it's #1 priority, but wouldn't change it. And I was like, this is spiritual violence against all of the children in prams going through here. The safekeeping of ancestral remains in different cultures have very different protocols, and it's definitely not supposed to be for public walking paths like that. So that kind of, and I've been spending time in collections for a few years in different cities by that point, but I was just like at my wit's end. And so from there, I think I kind of just like let it sit for a while, and they finally stopped having, they took the ancestors off display late last year, and then kind of like applauded themselves about it, but it's, you know, way too little too late. So I think it's interesting because I haven't worked in a museum as like a curator or a collection person or public engagement before. I've been one of the advisors to a few museums in Australia, and things are very slow to shift. And I think much worse is like the example of British Museum, where they just digitized everything and put it all online and didn't try to Google to connect with any of the source communities. And I know of other museums. Karin Lee, who's the head curator at the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, has like a super decolonial, and I rarely say that word, but like super decolonial strategic plan where they want to return everything, and they want to have home communities entirely involved in the process. And Switzerland, like what? So that's really encouraging. There are examples of people doing a lot better. And I thought of basically if I have a university kind of privilege to know where these collections are, and sometimes I would be able to get through because of the university email address I had a few years ago, and other community members wouldn't, to these kind of like gatekeeper collection managers, which are, you know, people following orders. It's not really necessarily their fault. It's just a cultural shift. Then I think about like most of my cousins who don't know any of these museums exist, don't know that there's a gap, don't know that our ancestors were brilliant people who made all of these different things, and instead are constantly given this like messaging that you're not enough, and you need to speak English, and you need to succeed in a white man's world, and you'll never be white enough, and, you know, try some bleaching cream and things like that. So if we can show my website, Evan, please. I'll just quickly talk about, actually, if you go to this, link, aoli.aca.melbourne. This is the most recent large-scale work. I just wanted to kind of show that I didn't really ask permission from the museums, that I sourced some of these images and played with them and changed them and focused them and abstracted them, because I don't really believe I should have to ask permission to access my culture. But I've done it in a way that I hopefully I won't be sued. And created an archive where there wasn't one. And Teresia Tiaiwa, the late Indigenous academic and African American academic from Kiribati and Fiji and Banaba, would say that we needed to create our own archives, as much as trying to access the ones that the Europeans and others have made of us. So I kind of created an international Samoan art archive because usually the best work on kind of an art history of Samoan people is only within New Zealand, and nothing ever talks about the diaspora who grew up in Australia, like myself, or the ones in Canada, like Jason Edward Lewis, or in the US, or in Hawaii, London, etc. So I really wanted to try and like just make some kind of contribution, and so this like is hosted by the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in perpetuity. I don't have to worry about like the domain dying, because if it was a community art project, it's definitely going to die. So yeah, that's, if you want to click through the link, if we could bring it up, we can just quickly have a look. Or I'll screen share myself. Let's try that. Okay. Does everybody see it? Great. Thanks, Evan. So these are short performances, and the visual language of tattoos across Great Ocean archipelagos kind of emulates the visual language of pottery, carving, and barcloth as well. So in this one, I kind of wanted to talk about the clear barcloth before the prints are kind of imprinted onto it. This is, and then 4 like vignette performance videos. This one particularly talking about language loss and that kind of the play of the tongue. Yeah, and then the poetry is there as well, wanting to kind of imagine what 2025 looks like, or looking at back at the past from 2025. And I've spoken for too long. Please, Marissa.
Great, thank you, Léuli. Just because we're at 8 p.m., I think I'll ask if anyone that's in the audience has a question or a comment to address to anyone on the panel tonight. There's a Q&A button kind of on the bottom right of your screen, so we might just have time for like 1 or 2 questions. But you can type your questions there, and we should all be able to see the questions and comments. In the meantime, I'll move on to one more question from me and Marianne. So in our curatorial text, I also wrote a little bit about thinking about Leanne Betasamazak Simpson's book, As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. And when I was reading this book, Simpson draws on personal experiences to teach the reader about constellated networks of relation and about various forms and articulations that theory can take. So we've kind of talked a little bit about how this might come up in your works, I think, without talking about it directly. But in Simpson's book, these experiences often include an effective response as a guiding force to questioning oppressive systems and structures. So I wanted to ask Léuli and Marissa, do you consider your work driven by affect or by that kind of emotive, not something that you're consciously thinking through, just a sense, kind of that affective emotional sense? Whichever one would like to start.
I can go. I think it's a combination. I mean, I don't know if that's like the most eloquent thing, but I think it's a combination of both of those things, I guess. I really think like thinking about these spaces and building these spaces does come part of the emotive. If that was the kind of the question that we were getting at, if it was stemming from like an emotional place. Do you mind maybe reframing the question for me? I might need to I want to answer it, and I want to answer it really with my brain.
Yeah, I think just in the conversation, I think you both kind of talked about creating work from an emotional place, kind of as an emotional response. And I guess thinking of affect is just kind of a way of theorizing emotional responses, right? So I was kind of thinking of this book, The Affect Theory Reader. They write about affect as those intensities that pass body to body, affect as a state of relation, as well as the passage of forces, affect as the name we give to those visceral forces, generally other than conscious knowing. So I think, Marissa, you kind of talked a little bit about even engaging with language, engaging with your family's history, and even the creation of Philippines. It has a slightly different tone than a lot of your other work, kind of coming from a really intimate place. And Léuli, obviously, a lot of your work is really tied to those very personal responses.
I'll just say that I think it's emotions are also rationality for lots of different cultures, just not the European post-Enlightenment ones. There's a binary in Europe, but nowhere else. I think that things come together, and I don't know if someone's see my work and feel anything, but I'm kind of making it for my ancestors and for other people to kind of, especially the Aoli work, the third in the series after Tafawata. I felt like the burden of having to educate Australians that it's not like a Pacific art history, it's specifically my people. And people are like, oh, but like, what about, and they're like, no, we're not all the same. Like, we're quite different. So yeah, I think some of the emotions are in the poetry as well, and in the movement of the body.
Okay, and I'll jump back in. I think, as we mentioned, like, this does feel, if you were to browse through kind of my past works, this is definitely tonally different. I think it is a lot more reflective, a lot more, it's less like synthesized, I would say, because so much of my work is really loud, cosplay, dressing up, pop song remixes, and this is just very much without those things, not making either one any less, I think, merited for art work. But I would say that, both of those kind of ways of working are talking about similarly serious things. And I think it is kind of points of access for me. So either having this work being, I guess, something that you use on a personal computer and a device, that's like one point of access. And it does come from like a very emotional place, because I think it is very vulnerable for me to not have all these different pop culture references. And I guess honestly, being like physically decked out in costume is very different. And yeah, this one definitely feels more so, I guess, personal, in the sense that it is talking about my experience. Whereas the other works are honestly a bit of, I mean, it is that, but it's also, I want people to feel like they want to dance. Like, I put a lot of dance music in it. I put a lot of things that kind of complicate those feelings, or I almost feel like the work in this program is a little bit more tonally straightforward, I would say.
Yeah, thank you both for taking that question. We do have a couple questions and some comments in the Q&A. I'm not sure, Marissa and Léuli, can you see the Q&A? Yeah, so some really nice comments, as well as a couple questions. One from Julie, who asks, it would be awesome for a discussion of the connection to the embodied knowledge and practice in their work, and how this impacts how they make their work. I haven't read the other question from Dana here, but let me just see. So Dana has a question about the situation going on about Australian languages. Many of the Indigenous ones in the area, Dana hears they are dying out. Is there any way of language revitalization at this point? And that kind of applies to what you've been talking about, your own languages as well. So I'll kind of open it up to you, Marissa and Léuli. if you want to address either of those. There's also a comment from Zoe just saying thank you. So thank you all.
I might just start. So I'm living in Mbandwa, Alice Springs, kind of the geographic center of Australia, so-called Australia. And it's NAIDOC week. It's Tuesday of NAIDOC week here, which is the National Aboriginal Islander Day of Remembrance Committee. And then it was a day of mourning in 1935 that has become a national cultural celebration. And the theme this year is always was, always will be. There are a lot of language projects that have been launched all around the country. A few months ago here in Arunda country, a language app was launched and language posters. And so there's a lot of work happening. Things are in very different stages. There are hundreds and hundreds of languages on this continent. And some are engulfed by English in the territories that comprise Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, the big cities. And yet they're also undergoing revival and have language nests. So there's, if you look up the AATSIS Institute, it's the Australian Indigenous, I'll find the correct acronym and put it in the chat. They have a really good set of resources. I think there's a lot of work happening, and I'm not necessarily qualified to comment on it. And then just thinking about the embodiment, I feel like, I'm not sure for you, Marissa, but I found it really hard to be in my body and make work this year, and being far from the people I would normally access to learn and to devise things together, instead doing it through a screen, has been really challenging. And so I feel like what I've been able to do is probably the best I can do, but not in non-pandemic times or non-intense fascist times. I don't know when that was, maybe a few generations ago or in the future, it might feel different.
I was just gonna agree that I find making work right now especially challenging. It's like definitely a time where I also am just returning to things that make me feel good in a time where things are really, really, really bad. So I guess my heart goes out to you, and I'm even digital space, I'm with you on that. I feel you so much. I guess in terms of embodied knowledge, it really is, I can just give an anecdotal quick story about the time that I tried to make chocolate rice, which is something that my grandmother would make for me growing up. And it was a treat. It's like a dessert. So it really is pretty much as you would imagine it, is like chocolate rice, almost like a rice pudding, but it's chocolate flavored. It's like creamy. And she made it and it was really good. And I remember making it. And you can also put dried fish on the top. It's like this very interesting conglomeration of things going on, salty, fishy, chocolate, fat. It's pretty good, for my opinion, but I can remember visiting my friends, going to cook them this very traditional meal. It was going to be eaten with our hands, and I really wanted to make chocolate rice because it was something that for me just felt so special, and it was like a very visceral memory. And looking at the things in the grocery store and not understanding some of the things that were there that I felt like I should know. And I just remember, like, in this Toronto apartment, it's like 35 degrees Celsius, sweating buckets, making this meal. And some of the things didn't turn out. And I just remember like keeling over the oven and being like, I'm a failure. My ancestors hate me. I can't do this. But also finding the okayness in the real, like, this is where I am, this is who I am, this is like, even this is like, of course, an extension of my art practice, because it's just who I am, and being okay with it not maybe being like authentic enough, which is obviously a very much loaded term as well, and it doesn't really mean anything, but it seems to be something that's tossed around, especially when we're talking about food. And food is such an important part of my cultural upbringing and where I place myself. So in terms of embodied knowledge, I mean, honestly, it's kind of like a bit of a roller coaster, but really about acceptance too. So the way that it impacts the way that I make work is finding identity in the parts that are deemed as failures or inadequacies, because in many ways, the inadequacies are what gives me place, I guess, a place amongst all this ugly, damaged, glitched world that we have. And in terms of languages, I mean, the fact that there are really amazing Filipinx people that are continuing to bring Babayan back into cultural relevance of sorts. My friend has designed the Raptors logo in Babayan text, and it's really amazing. I should definitely show everyone the link. It's so cool. It's like this blending of traditional scripture, but also, you know, basketball, which if any of you know, Filipino people love basketball. And yeah, so there's this kind of revitalization, but of course, it's not the only language that has existed. It's just the one that if I was to be back in the Philippines, it might be something that I would have studied because that's the language that my family speaks. But there's so many different languages and so many different kinds of communication that come from that region. So I think it's great that I am returning to this language and asking my friends about it. But also there's so much more work for me to do in terms of learning about what other types of scripture there are, what other kind of languages that honestly might be somewhere tied up into my own history. And tattoos are really important. All these different kind of ways that these are practices that are resurging. I hope to one day get some tattoos in the traditional way, which I've heard is very painful, but that's kind of part of the process. So lots of different kinds of ways that we revitalize our language, and in that, our culture, our food. Thank you.
I thought I'd just add that I think when you're speaking, I'm thinking about, you know, probably the whole point of my art practice this year is imagining like restoration of temples and land-based practices. But I also like struggle to imagine myself living at home because it's so violent. And maybe just like little steps with the food is the way forward. I got really excited when I was on exchange in France a long time ago, when with the other Australian and New Zealand international students, we finally found the like Vietnamese street, so we could get all the bok choy and all of these and red rice and things that all the mainstream French people were like, c'est quoi ça? Like, they just couldn't cope. So I think the familiarities are not necessarily only our ancestral ones, right?
Yeah, we have a bunch of like, now, I mean, I just came back to like my hometown after years of being away, and now we have all these grocery stores, and there's like a couple like kitchens and stuff that are serving Filipino food, which is really exciting. So those things are just like make my heart race, you know. It's like just those identifiers of like, okay, these are places where I belong, you know.
As you're speaking, I was also thinking about Sky Hopinka's work, and further up the coast, there's 3 or 4 generations of intermarriage between Ilocano and Tlingit peoples, and my friend is from that community, and so they call themselves Tlingapino. It's pretty cool, with like moose adobo and things like that. So there's, you know, the cultures shift and come together and change in like Juneau in Alaska.
Well, it looks like we are just about out of time. Just really want to thank you, Léuli and Marissa, for this discussion. I feel very inspired, and I wish we could, talk some more, but this has been super great. So thank you so much. Did you want to add anything, Mariana?
Yeah, I also just want to say thank you both to Marissa and Léuli. I've been kind of taking notes. There's a lot of really great things that came up in the conversation. Yeah, really inspiring that I'll keep thinking about after this. And thank you for everyone for coming and for also sharing your questions. Thank you to Evan for doing the tech and all the links that are being shared in the chat as well. So I guess if you're attending, make sure to copy or screenshot the links that are in the chat before we exit this meeting. But yeah, I guess we'll close it off. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you
so much.